Hey everyone, so this is the last video for for motivation, which are some types of motivators. Mostly biological and social is what we're going to focus on. Obviously, these are not the only motivators we have. These are not the only things that drive human behavior and thinking, but these are the ones that that we focus on from an AP Psych standpoint. And again, mostly biological and social are the two big umbrellas, kind of two big headings we're going to focus on um, during this slideshow. So anyway, so we'll start with hunger. Hunger is, kind of if you think about like, the most constant motivator we have, it's pretty much hunger. It's the thing that, I always joke I really love food, but it's constant. I mean, not constant like 24/7, but it's every day it's going to be there. You're going to be hungry every single day at some point, even if it's minor. You're going to need food. You're going to crave food. So, um, it is the most constant biological motivator we have. And the hypothalamus itself, if you remember back to the brain, the hypothalamus is the one that sounds the alarms for whether we're hungry or not, based on the regulation of levels of chemicals and hormones and things like that in the body. So if the hypothalamus is modified or damaged or something, it can affect our hunger. So what I mean by that is like the lateral hypothalamus is the part of the hypothalamus that, if stimulated, it wants us to eat. Like it's the thing that um, it basically tells us, hey, you need to eat. Um, if for some reason it was destroyed or damaged, then there would be zero motivation biologically for the subject to want to eat. I know that's hard to believe, but it can happen. It's the hunger center of the brain, the lateral hypothalamus. Now, the ventromedial hypothalamus, this is the one that essentially motivates us to stop eating. Um, it says, "Well, hey, we're full. You don't need to eat anymore. Whatever." Um, if this gets damaged, then the subject would constantly eat, or constantly have a desire to eat. And I know I shouldn't laugh at the picture at the bottom, but obviously the lab rat on the left has had their ventromedial hypothalamus damaged or destroyed, and it just constantly eats, and it looks like a softball because of that. So I have yet. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I have yet to hear about this happening in humans. Um, I'm not saying it hasn't, but I don't really know of any case personally where this may have happened. But anyway, if the ventromedial hypothalamus was damaged, then they would not want to stop eating and continually eat and gain weight, possibly even to the point of death. Okay. Now, in terms of in regards to kind of our own behaviors, this theory, the set point theory for hunger, basically just said, sorry, basically just says that our body kind of works like a thermostat. If you know anything about how thermostats work, if it gets too hot, the thermostat's set at a certain temperature. If it gets above that temperature, then the cooling is going to kick on and try to lower it back down. And if it gets too cold, then it's going to kick on and heat it up until it gets back to that point. So what this theory says is that we kind of have a natural body fat level um, within each of us, and you know basically that's our quote unquote set point weight, and that our body kind of fights against changes to that. In other words, if your body weight, like according to this theory, if your set body weight is, like, just hypothetically speaking, like let's say 200 pounds, um, then if you were trying to lose weight, then what this theory would say is that it would be more difficult for you to lose weight than to gain weight back up to 200 if you were to lose it. So in other words, it might take you a while to lose it, but then not so long to get back up to that. This helps explain people who have issues with weight loss, basically saying that the body is not letting them do it because the body wants to maintain that set point of whatever this number is. So that's just so basically that says that, you may not feel hungry because if you drop down below that weight, or sorry, you may feel more hungry when you drop below that weight because the body's trying to get you back up to that weight. So that's just one theory to help explain weight loss and kind of, the body trying to stay at a certain weight. Now, obesity, we don't talk a ton about, kind of health stuff and psychology, but like obesity is contributed, or obesity is psychological because a lot of times, people get obese and don't even, realize how it happened because they're either not motivated to get away from that, or the motivation to eat and things like that got them to that point in the first place. Now that 1 in 6 Americans are overweight might actually be lower than what it is now because these PowerPoints are a couple years old. So I need to probably double check on that again and make sure that theory or that hasn't changed. But the United States has a very high rate of obesity. I always joke about my weight in class and things like that. And the whether I want to admit it or not, the fact of the matter is that if you look at my height, my weight, and things like that, like I'm technically considered obese. Now, I don't think I look like it per se, but by definition, according to the medical definition of it, I am. So I fall in that category. Not something I'm proud to admit, but it is what it is. But obesity can contribute to things like heart disease, diabetes specifically is a huge link to obesity. And many forms of cancer, sometimes kidney failure can be linked to it. So, and obesity can be obviously a motivator to not get there. And then unfortunately, sometimes once you get there, you don't have motivation to get out. These are just some factors involved with getting there: sedentary lifestyles, lack of sleep. I would venture to say in this time that we're in now, with the fact that I think you're going to see obesity numbers maybe go one of two ways. Either you're going to see it go up because people aren't getting out of their house very much, or you're going to see it go down because people are getting out of their house and exercising more because that's the only thing they can do. But there are a lot of factors. It's not just eating. I mean, sometimes there's, you don't get enough sleep. You don't get outside enough. You don't have an active lifestyle. And sometimes just genetics. I mean, sometimes it's just your family history can also play a large role in it. So, so unfortunately, obesity is one of those things that, along with hunger, or is directly linked to hunger, which is the strongest biological motivator we have. Now, also directly linked to hunger is, unfortunately, and this is not something I like talking about, but eating disorders are, linked to hunger. And there's two eating disorders we talk about. Obviously, there are more than two total, but the two we talk about are anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia is when you basically self-impose a form of starvation, or you just don't eat at all, or you barely eat any. You just eat enough to survive, and it's severe weight loss to the point of being unhealthy. Because there's an obsessive fear of obesity, and your definition of obesity is not what obese is. If you ever look into the motivations for people who are anorexic and their fear of obese, like their definition of obese is probably not what the medical definition of obese is. It's really sad sometimes to see these situations occur. The vast majority of anorexics are women. That does not mean males can't be anorexic, but the vast majority of them are women. Um, and most psychologists think that the society that we live in that has this, and I think this has gotten better. Just FYI, I really think that our culture has started to embrace various definitions of what a body should look like, or what the ideal body is. I think that there for a while, thin was what the what everyone wanted to be, but I think people are accepting different body types as totally normal, totally fine. And I think that there has been some improvement there, but I also think that the constant barrage that people see of, oh, this is sexy, this is what you should be looking like that constant barrage of cultural images of what the ideal body is, can have a psychological effect on people who are trying to get to that point. And maybe they don't through normal dieting or exercise, so they just resort to eating disorders. Um, and they want to be perfect in their physical form, whatever that may be. So anorexia is again an obsessive fear of being overweight or obese leads to those habits. And on the flip side of that, you have bulimia, and bulimia is also an eating disorder, but this is when you eat either just normally or you eat a lot and then get rid of it, whether it's by vomiting, excessively exercising, laxatives, anything to get rid of that from the body so that it doesn't affect your weight. Um, and this is usually a little harder to detect from a physical standpoint. Usually, if someone's anorexic, it's easier to detect from the outside view than it is for bulimia or for bulimics, because they don't necessarily fluctuate or they just kind of stay within a normal range, but they may not um, they may not get super thin like you would if you're anorexic. Um, I actually went to high school with a kid who was a pretty serious wrestler. And if you know anything about wrestling, they have to maintain a certain weight in order to compete in a certain weight class. So he was constantly trying to stay at the weight he needed to be at in order to wrestle at that weight class. And so in order to maintain that weight, he resorted to basically being a bulimic, and nobody really knew until our senior year. He just kind of disappeared for a few months, and we found out he was at a facility for people who had eating disorders, and because it was starting to affect his health. So, and no one would have known. I mean, he wasn't super thin, super, obese or anything. He was just kind of had a normal body, and it was just very odd. But this tends to have higher numbers of males than anorexia does, but it's still the overwhelming majority of eating disorders do happen in women. So there's that. Okay, not to get weird or anything, but if you're talking about biological motivators other than hunger, sex is probably the next highest one on our list. But look, sexual motivation from basically the motivations we have for what is sexually attractive to us really it varies. It varies by the biological influences, the chemicals that get released in the body, the hormones and that are triggered by, and the emotions of sex drives, cognition, things that we just cognitively think are attractive to us, the things that we find personally preferable in someone that we find as sexually attractive. So that can be physical features, that can be personality, that can be race, it can be anything. And then social cultural influences also have a large role in what we find sexually attractive. And that can be, religious preferences, that can be, cultural, if you grew up in this culture, then sometimes you are expected to only be involved in relationships with people from that same culture. So that can also play a large role in what is motivating to us in regards to sexual behavior. Okay, so now flipping over to social motivators. Obviously, this one's very simple. We all want to be successful, and in terms of achievement, like trying to achieve, the things that are motivating to us. It's a drive to succeed, usually through competition, usually through achievement of some kind, whether that's in competition with someone else or just in competition with yourself to try to get to the highest level of whatever you're trying to get to, whether it's grades, sports, job, whatever. This is the most obvious type of motivator we have socially. Usually we learn this pretty early. Our parents tend to have a very profound effect on us with this. So if our parents are very driven people, we tend to be pretty driven as well, and vice versa. People who are highly motivated for achievement success may also put things like or other goals on the back burner. They may delay relationships or a family in order to get to a certain point in their job or whatever. That's one example, but people who are highly motivated for this type of success are willing to do things that others may not be able to get to because of that. And this can be very different across cultures. Some, like our definition of success and achievement here in America is very different from other cultures in the world. We tend to be a very individualistic culture. In other words, we tend to emphasize personal success, the success of the individual. Look what this person did. Look what I am. Social media has made that even worse. But there are other cultures that are collectivistic, which are more driven by success of the community or success of the society, family unit, whatever. They're both achievement. Both are motivators for achievement and success, whether it's individual or collective. It's the same type of motivation. It's just the end result or the emphasis, I guess, is different depending on the society that we may be a part of. Also, in achievement motivation, there's the fear of failure and the fear of success. Now, the fear of failure is pretty self-explanatory. People don't want to fail, so that's what drives them. Most athletes I know, and even as a coach, this drives me. I want to be successful. I don't want to be a failure. So that's what drives me to be successful in my arena as a coach. Same as a teacher too. You don't want kids to fail. You don't want kids to not achieve what they want and what they work towards. So it drives you as a teacher. So that's the fear of failure. But on the flip side of that, the fear of success might be a little hard to kind of understand, but the fear of success is basically that the fear that if you succeed in one area, you will fail in another. The best example I can think of this is a few years after I started teaching, I was talking to a friend of mine that I went to college with. We were both wanting to teach and coach at the same time. And we ran into each other at a football game at UNC one weekend, and we were just kind of talking, and he made the comment that was like, yeah, I got offered he's a basketball coach. He's like, I got offered the head basketball job at this school, but I turned it down. And I was like, what, why would you turn that down? And he said that the reason he turned it down was because he was afraid that if he took that job, in order to be successful at that job, he would have to sacrifice family time, and he would become a failure in some way as a husband, as a dad, or as a friend, as a brother. So he decided that it wasn't the right time. It was too far. The school was a little bit further away than where he was currently going to teach. So he just kind of took it as to him, he was more afraid of failing in those areas than being successful. So in other words, the fear of being successful in that and failing in others was too much for him. So that's why he decided not to do it. But that's what the fear of success is. Okay, last couple things. Social conflict. Look, everybody has conflicts with people. Everybody has conflicts with friends or family at some time, and sometimes the motivation to resolve that conflict can lead us in a bunch of different directions. And it really just depends on, like, what are we trying? Are we trying to arrive at a conclusion that makes us happy and that's it? Or are we trying to arrive at a conclusion that makes everybody happy? Um, that those motivators are very different depending on the social conflict. So there are these four, I guess you could say, these four uh, outcomes to social conflict that we all could be faced with. Approach. That basically, think about it like this: approach is desirable, avoidance is undesirable. So approach is when you have two desirable options for a social um, conflict. Those two desirable outcomes to a social conflict. For example, let's say that you get asked out to the prom or whatever, or maybe that's a sore subject right now for some of you, but let's say you get asked out to a dance by two very good options, two very great people. You'd be happy to go with either one of them. I was obviously never in that situation because no one asked me anywhere. But anyway, but those are two desirable outcomes. Either choice, either outcome is going to be, in your eyes, a good outcome. Flip side of that, you could have avoidance. This is when you have two undesirable outcomes. Let's say you go out with whoever you choose for that for a while, but then it comes to the time where, okay, well, I'm not feeling this. This isn't great. So, you decide you got to break up with that person. So, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. You can do it in person. You can do it over the phone. Don't ever text, by the way. Don't do that. Just don't. Okay. But let's say you can do it over the phone, do it in person. Both of them are undesirable. Like, you don't want to do either one. Both of them are going to kind of suck, but you got to do it. So you got to pick between that. That's avoidance. Approach avoidance is when no matter what you choose, there's going to be a good and a bad outcome no matter what. There's going to be both a good thing and a bad thing about any choice you make. That's approach avoidance. The example I use with this would be like, you know, if you have to, if it comes down to, let's say you're having to choose between, let's say you have to choose between two classes on your schedule, and obviously there's going to be, no matter what you choose, there's going to be, each class has good things about it, but each class also has bad things about it. So that's an approach avoidance. And the last one is multiple approach avoidance. This is when you have, with these first three examples, approach, avoidance, and approach avoidance, that's when you only have like two choices and you pick from those two. This last one is when you have multiple options and all options have good and bad things about it. The example I use with this is choosing a college. Like, usually you have more than two, maybe you have more than two options to pick from. And each of them is going to have good things and bad things about it. But again, that you have multiple choices, but you have to choose one. And no matter what you choose, there's going to be good, desirable, and undesirable parts about any choice. But it's your eyes, you're probably looking for the one that has the most desirable and the least undesirable. And that's probably what you're going to go with. Okay, so that's it. So hopefully that was pretty painless. So that's it for motivation. Obviously, have any questions, send me send me an email. And again, I mentioned it back on the very first episode, the first video this week when I was talking about intelligence and the news about school not being in person again for the rest of the year. But just know I'm not thrilled about it. I'm upset about it. Just and I hate that we can't do normal class again. But reach out if you need anything, and I will do my best to help you out. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your week whenever you're watching this, and a good weekend. And I'll see you next week. Take care, guys.